The river flooded his fields every spring. He built a berm with a shovel and stopped at the Blackwater River crested on a Thursday morning in April of 1987. That was the year it mattered. The water came up fast, the way it always did in Calhoun County, West Virginia, 2 feet by midnight, another 18 inches before dawn. By the time Roy Maynard walked out to the edge of his south field at 6:15 that morning, the fence posts were already gone. 14 of them. He counted where they weren't. Roy was 61 years old, had been working the same 84 acres along the Blackwater for 29 years. Inherited the land from his father in 1958, same year his father's knees gave out. Same year Roy's oldest started school. The farm sat in a natural bowl on the east bend of the river, 3/4 of a mile south of the Pineview Bridge. Low ground. Always had been. Roy knew it the day he took the deed. The south field covered 22 acres. It was the best dirt on the property. Dark, heavy, river-bottom soil that held moisture through the driest part of August. Roy ran corn on it when the market was right, soybeans when it wasn't. In a good year, the south field alone paid the note on the equipment barn and half the fertilizer costs for the whole farm. In 1987, the south field sat under water for 11 days. Roy stood at the edge of the water that Thursday morning. The corn he'd planted in the 3rd week of March, 8 acres of it, was gone. Not damaged, gone, submerged under 14 inches of brown river water that smelled of upstream clay and old leaves. The remaining 14 acres hadn't been planted yet. He'd planned to put soybeans in that week. The tractor was still in the barn with the planter attached. It would stay there. No point moving it into a lake. He walked the perimeter of the field where the water met the high ground. The distance was about 340 yards of edge. He paced it twice, wrote nothing down, just looked. Roy Maynard was not a man who talked much about what he was thinking. His wife Loretta had learned that over 34 years of marriage. When something was bothering him, he got quieter, not louder. That Thursday morning, after walking back to the house from the south field, he poured a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and didn't say anything for about 20 minutes. Loretta didn't ask. She knew the field was under. She'd seen it from the kitchen window. Roy had dealt with the spring flooding his entire farming life. His father had dealt with it before him. The Blackwater jumped its banks most years, not every year, but most. Sometimes it was a nuisance. A few acres saturated for 3 or 4 days, draining slowly, costing a week of planting time. Recoverable, you replanted, you adjusted. That was farming along a river. But 1987 was different. The winter had been wet. The snowpack in the mountains upstream had been heavier than usual. When the spring melt came in the 2nd week of April, it came all at once. The National Weather Service office in Charleston had issued a flood advisory for Calhoun County on April 8th. Roy had read it. Had driven down to look at the river gauge on the bridge the morning of the 9th. The gauge read 7.2 feet. Flood stage was 9. By the morning of April 10th, the gauge read 11.4 feet. The water reached the south field at 2:00 in the morning. Roy knew the cost before he finished his coffee. The 8 acres of corn, gone completely. He'd replant, but replanting this late meant lower yield, shorter growing season, corn that came in small and tight in September, when the price was usually depressed. Call it a $4,200 loss on the corn. The soybean planting delayed by at least 2 weeks, which meant shorter growing season there too. Maybe 15% lower yield if the summer went short. Another $1,800 on the conservative side. The fence posts and wire, $340 worth of materials he'd put in the previous fall. The cost of pumping the field once the river dropped, he'd need to run the irrigation pump backwards to pull standing water toward the drainage ditch on the north end. Diesel, Labor, another $180. He was looking at $6,500, maybe more. He finished the coffee, went to the barn, sat on the running board of the Oliver 1855 and watched the rain pick up again outside the barn door. The county extension office was in Grantsville, 11 miles north on Route 16. Roy had been in the office twice in 29 years, once to ask about a disease he'd seen on his soybeans in 1971, and once to pick up soil testing materials. He drove up to Grantsville on the Friday after the flooding started, while the field was still underwater. He wasn't sure what he expected the extension agent to tell him. He went anyway. The agent's name was Clifford Hewitt. He'd been in the position 7 years. Knew the farms along the Blackwater reasonably well, or said he did. Roy explained the situation. The south field. The flood, the losses. The recurring problem. Hewitt pulled out a county topographic map, laid it flat on the desk, pointed to the bowl shape of Roy's land, said the terrain was the issue, said the river would always find that low point. Said Roy had 3 options: tile drainage, which would help with saturation but not with a flood of that scale. The water table during a flood event would overwhelm tile. A diversion channel, which would require a Corps of Engineers permit and cost somewhere between $22,000 and $40,000 depending on scope. Or crop insurance, which would cover some of the loss but not the lost opportunity or the year-over-year problem. Roy listened to all 3. Asked a few questions. Thanked Hewitt for his time. Hewitt said he was sorry about the situation. Said the flooding along the Blackwater had been a chronic problem for the farms in that bend. Said some farmers upstream had just accepted it and adjusted their planting schedules and crop selections accordingly. Said maybe that was worth thinking about. Roy drove home on Route 16, stopped at the Pineview Bridge on the way back, got out of the truck, looked at the river. The water was still high, down from 11.4 feet to 9.7, still well above flood stage, moving fast. Brown, he stood on the bridge for about 10 minutes. Then he got back in the truck and drove the rest of the way home. The field drained over the following week. The river dropped to 6.1 feet by April 19th, below flood stage for the first time in 9 days. Roy walked the south field the morning of April 20th, boots sinking into the soft mud at every step. The field smelled of river silt and rotting vegetation. The standing water was gone, but the ground would need another 10 days before it was firm enough to run equipment on it. He walked the north edge of the field, where the high ground began. The transition was visible. You could see where the floodwater had stopped, where it had lapped at the slightly elevated ground along the field's northern boundary. The high ground was only a few feet above the field level, 3 feet, maybe 3.5. But those 3 feet had been enough. The north quarter of the south field, about 5 acres, had stayed dry during the entire flood. The rest had been underwater. Roy crouched down at the transition point, pressed his palm into the dry dirt, then into the wet. The dry soil was firm. The wet soil sank under the pressure of his hand. He stood up, looked south toward the river, looked north at the high edge, 3.5 feet of elevation difference. That was the gap. Roy Maynard had not gone to college, had finished high school in 1943 in Grantsville and gone straight into the Army. Came back in 1946 and worked his father's farm until 1958. He had no engineering training, no soil science degree. What he had was 29 years of watching water move across his land and a particular kind of attention that came from having to understand a place to survive in it. He walked the north boundary of the south field, paced the length again, about 340 yards of edge, where the field dropped toward the river. He paced it a second time, slower. He was calculating something. not with paper, just walking and thinking. The idea was simple, almost too simple to take seriously at first. If the north edge of the south field, that 3.5-foot natural rise, had kept 5 acres dry through the entire flood, then the question was whether that elevation could be extended. Not across the whole field. That was too much ground to move. But along the western edge, where the field was most exposed to the river bend. The bend was where the water came in. Every year. Always from the west. If you put a raised berm along the west edge of the field, running north to south for about 200 yards, connecting the natural high ground at the north to the higher pasture ground at the south. If you built that berm up to 4 feet of height and made it wide enough at the base to hold under water pressure, you'd close the gap. The water still came from the river. But it would hit the berm first. Roy walked home. Found a piece of paper. Drew the field in rough outline. Drew where the berm would go. Measured the pencil lines with his thumb. Thought about the volume of soil that would need to move. It was not a small amount of soil. He called his neighbor, Gene Arbaugh, that evening. Gene farmed the 60 acres adjacent to Roy's north boundary. Had a Cat D5 dozer he used for clearing and grading. Roy asked if Gene thought the idea was feasible. Gene came over the next morning, walked the field with Roy, looked at the western edge, stood where the water would come in. Gene said a dozer could push the berm up in 2 days, maybe 3. Said it would need to be at least 10 feet wide at the base to stay stable. Said Roy would probably need to seed the face of it with something that would hold. Fescue, ideally. Saeed the dozer work would run Roy about $900 for 3 days of Gene's time and fuel if Roy wanted to handle the fine grading himself. Roy said he'd think about it. He thought about it through most of May. The field dried out. He planted soybeans, late, into ground that was still heavier than he liked. The corn he replanted in the first week of May came up thin. He looked at the plants on a Friday afternoon in early June and knew the yield was going to be off. The season was already short. He thought about the $900 for the dozer work. He thought about the $6,500 he'd lost in April. He thought about 1983, when the flooding had cost him around $3,200, and 1979, when it had cost him a hay cutting and part of the fence line. Year after year, the same problem in the same field. Different severity, same cause. In July of 1987, Roy Maynard decided to build the berm. He didn't start with Gene's dozer. He started with a spade. The reason was practical. He wanted to understand the ground before he moved large volumes of it. He wanted to know what was under the topsoil along the western edge of the field, if there was rock close to the surface, or if the soil composition changed in the first 3 feet. He needed to know that before a dozer pushed 200 yards of it into a pile. He started digging test holes. 6 of them, spaced 40 yards apart along the western boundary. Each hole went down 3 feet. He dug them by hand with a long-handled spade over 3 days in the second week of July. He noted what he found: the depth of the topsoil layer, the color change into the subsoil, any gravel or clay layers. What he found was good news. The soil along the western edge was deep and consistent. Dark topsoil to about 14 inches, then a clay-heavy subsoil that was dense and slow draining. That clay was the key. Clay-heavy subsoil compacted well. Under the weight of a berm and the pressure of floodwater, it would hold. It wouldn't erode or seep the way sandy soil would. He dug 1 more hole, this one 4 feet deep, on a morning in late July when the air was heavy and still and the temperature was already in the mid-80s by 7 dullo. The clay at 4 feet was gray-blue, almost waxy. He pressed his thumb into it, left a clear print. The soil held the shape. Roy looked at the print for a moment. Then he filled the hole back in and went to call Jean. Jean brought the D5 over on a Tuesday morning in the first week of August. Roy had already marked the berm line with wooden stakes, 12 of them, placed every 17 yards along the 200-yard western boundary. He'd tied orange surveyor's tape to each stake. The line ran from the corner of the natural high ground in the north to the edge of the higher pasture ground in the south, following the gentle curve of the field's western edge. The dozer work took 2.5 days. Jean pushed soil from the field's side of the berm line, pulling from within the field, not from outside it. Roy had decided on this specifically. Pulling material from the field meant the field would be slightly lower on the protected side, which would actually help drainage. The water that did get in, rain, not river, would have a natural slope to drain toward the center of the field. The berm came up to 4 feet and 3 inches at its highest point. It was widest at the base, 11 feet across at the south end where the ground was softer. Roy checked the height every 50 yards with a hand level and a measuring rod he'd made from a piece of fence post. He and Jean adjusted twice during the work, raised the north end by 8 inches, lowered a high spot in the middle. Jean finished the rough shaping on the afternoon of the second day. Roy spent the morning of the third day on the fine grading, running the Oliver tractor with a blade attachment. He made 3 passes along the face of the berm, smoothing the slope to about a 2-to-1 grade, 2 feet of horizontal run for every 1 foot of rise. Gentle enough that grass would establish on it. Steep enough that water sheeting down the face wouldn't puddle. He seeded the berm face with fescue the following week. 30 pounds of seed. Mixed it with a straw mulch he'd already been baling from the pasture. Pressed the seed in with a roller he'd borrowed from Jean. Watered it twice with the irrigation hose from the barn well, 90 minutes each time. The total cost was $912 for Jean's dozer work, $47 for the fescue seed, $18 for the straw mulch binder, and about 40 hours of Roy's own labor over 3 weeks. The labor he didn't count in dollars. Farming was labor. That was the work. The fescue was up by the end of August. Not dense yet, too early for that, but established. Green shoots covering the face of the berm in irregular patches, thickening from the base up. By October, the berm face was solid green. Roy walked the top of it one afternoon in late October, testing for softness. The soil under the grass was firm. The fescue roots were already locking it together. He told Loretta that evening it looked like it would hold. She asked hold against what? He said she'd see in the spring. April of 1988 came in dry. No flood. The Blackwater stayed well below flood stage through the entire spring. Roy planted his south field on schedule, first week of May, corn on the south 8 acres and soybeans on the rest. The berm stood there. Unused, green, quiet, neighbors drove by on the county road, and a few of them mentioned it. Asked Roy what he was building. He said it was a flood barrier. A few of them nodded. 1 or 2 said it was a lot of work for a problem that came and went. Roy said yes, it was. He didn't say much else about it. April of 1989 was different. The winter had been wet again. February brought heavy rain on top of still frozen ground, and the Blackwater had risen in March before the traditional spring melt even started. By the first week of April, the river was already running at 7.8 feet. The Weather Service issued a flood advisory on April 5th, a flood warning on April 7th. Roy planted nothing that week. He watched the river gauge. The Blackwater crested at 10.6 feet on the morning of April 9, 1989. That was 1.8 feet lower than the 1987 crest, but still well above flood stage. Roy was out at the south field at 5:30 that morning, before the light was fully up, walking the western boundary. The water was at the base of the berm by 6 a.m. It came across the low ground to the west of the field, moving in a slow sheet, the color of weak coffee, carrying small sticks and dead leaves. It found the berm at its lowest point first, the north end, where the berm tied into the natural high ground. The water hit the base of the berm there and stopped. Started rising against the face of it. Roy stood on top of the berm and watched the water level climb against the fescue-covered slope. By 8:30 in the morning, the water on the west side of the berm was at 2 feet up the face. The berm was 4 feet 3 inches tall. Still 2 feet of freeboard. Roy walked the full length of the berm. No seeping on the dry side. No signs of slumping. The clay subsoil was doing what clay did, holding. The water peaked against the berm at 2 feet 7 inches up the face. That was as high as it got. The river crest passed sometime in the early afternoon. By 4 p.m., the water on the west side of the berm was visibly dropping. Roy walked the berm again at 4:30. Dry on the east side. Completely dry. The south field was dry. He walked back to the house. Loretta was in the kitchen. He told her the berm had held. She asked how much water. He held his hand at waist level to show her. She nodded and went back to what she was doing. That was the extent of the conversation. Gene Arbaugh drove over the following morning to look at the berm. He'd seen his own low-ground flood, lost a section of fence and some alfalfa on his south quarter. He walked the Maynard berm from one end to the other, looking at the face, the base, the connection points at each end. He didn't say much for a while. Then, he said the fescue had held it together. Said without the root mat the face might have scoured. Roy said he figured that was why you seeded it. Gene stood there for another minute looking at the field, the dry field, the planted field that would still get planted on schedule, because the water had never reached it. He said he might want to do something similar on his south quarter. Roy said he could describe how he'd done it. That spring of 1989, Roy planted the south field the 3rd week of April, 2 weeks earlier than the previous 2 years. Corn on the south 8 acres, soybeans on the north 14. The growing season was full length. The corn came in at 142 bushels per acre, 17 bushels above the county average for that year. The soybeans came in at 44 bushels, close to his best year on that field. He never contacted the county extension office to report the results, never called the weather service. Wrote nothing to any farm publication. The berm was just a feature of his farm now. A line of grass running north to south along the western edge of the south field. You could see it from the county road if you knew to look for it. By 1992, 3 other farms along the Blackwater Bend had built similar berms. Roy had walked 2 of them with their owners, pointing out where he'd placed the stakes, how wide he'd made the base, what grade he'd given the face. He didn't charge for this, didn't think to. They were neighbors. That was what neighbors did. The Blackwater flooded again in the spring of 1993, the worst flood in Calhoun County since 1985. The river crested at 13.1 feet on April 14th. Water came across the low ground west of Roy's south field in a solid sheet, 18 inches deep in places. It hit the berm and stopped. The water level on the west face reached 3 feet 1 inch, 14 inches below the top of the berm, the highest it had ever been. Roy walked the berm during the flood. He did this at 6 a.m., at noon, and at 4 p.m., checking the base, checking for seepage. The fescue on the face was submerged on the lower third of the berm. Above the water line, the grass was untouched, still winter brown and dry. The south field was dry through all of it. The following week, Roy tilled and planted. He was in the field on April 22nd, 3 days after the water receded from the west side of the berm. The ground was soft, but workable. He put the John Deere 4240 through it in low gear, pulling the chisel plow at 3 miles per hour, breaking up the compaction from winter. The soil turned up dark and heavy and right. Clifford Hewitt, the county extension agent, had driven out to look at several of the flooded farms along the Blackwater Bend after the 1993 event, documenting losses for USTA disaster assistance applications. He drove past Roy's farm on the county road, saw the dry south field, and pulled over. He walked up to the berm, looked at it for a few minutes. Then he walked up to the farmhouse and knocked. Roy answered. He knew Hewitt from the 1987 visit to the extension office. They hadn't spoken since. Hewitt asked about the berm. Roy described it, the dimensions, the soil work, the fescue seeding. Said he'd built it in August of 1987. Said it had held through every flood since. Hewitt asked what the total cost had been. Roy said under $1,000 for outside work, about 40 hours of his own time. Hewitt was quiet for a moment. He said the county had been looking at flood mitigation options for the Blackwater Bend farms. Said the Corps of Engineers had done a study in 1991. The diversion channel option had been estimated at $31,000 per farm. Average. Federal cost-share programs could cover 60% of that. Still left each farmer with $12,400 out of pocket. Most of them hadn't gone forward. Roy said he understood that. He didn't say anything else about the $977 his berm had cost him. Hewitt drove back to Grantsville. 3 months later, he sent Roy a letter, said the extension office was putting together a Blackwater Basin flood management handout for county farmers. Asked if Roy would be willing to let them include the berm approach as a case study. No names required if Roy preferred. Roy wrote back, said they could use his name. Said the dimensions were 200 yards long, 4 feet 3 inches tall, 11 feet wide at the base, 2-to-1 face grade, fescue seeded. Said the critical thing was the clay subsoil. It needed to be clay heavy for the base to hold under water pressure. Said the connection points at each end had to tie into existing high ground, or the water would just go around. The extension office published the handout in the spring of 1994. 14 farms along the Blackwater Bend received it. 5 of them built berms that summer. 3 more built them the following year. Roy Maynard farmed the South Field for another 14 years after that. The berm held through the floods of 1996, 2001, and 2004. The 2004 flood crested at 10.9 feet, the second highest on record for that stretch of the Blackwater. The water came up the face of the berm to 2 feet 9 inches. Held, drained, left the field dry. Roy retired in 2006 at 80 years old. Sold the farm to his daughter's family, who had been helping work it since the late 1990s. They planted the south field the spring after they took over. Ran corn on the south 8 acres, same as Roy had. The berm is still there. The fescue on its face has been reseeded twice since 1987. The base has spread a little at the south end, widened by time and the weight of soil. A neighbor who farms the land adjacent, a man who moved to Calhoun County in 2008 and didn't know Roy, asked Roy's daughter about the raised strip of grass along the west edge of the south field. She told him what it was. He said it looked like it had been there a long time. She said it had been there since 1987. Said her father built it with a spade and a borrowed dozer and 30 pounds of fescue seed. Said it had never been overtopped, not once in nearly 40 years. The neighbor nodded. Said he might want to do something similar on his low ground by the river. She said she'd ask her father about the dimensions. Roy still lives in Calhoun County. He's 98. Doesn't get out to the farm much anymore. But the field is still planted every spring. The berm is still there. The Blackwater still floods most years. The south field stays dry, a shovel, a borrowed dozer, and a row of grass. That was the whole of it. Still working.